My primary work has been on the place of Ukraine in more of the scope of Russia's great power sphere of influence internationally, and how this has really provoked the game of great power politics, and how what we've seen in the last year especially has had a profound impact, not only obviously on Ukraine and on Russia, but on the international system as a whole. And so that's some of what I'll touch on today. In starting, I would actually pick up on one of David's last points, which is I would take Euromaidan as ongoing. And part of that evaluation extends well beyond February of 2014, well into even now, primarily because I don't think we have seen any kind of stabilization or any kind of level of continuity that we would say that we could recognize very much the end of that movement. And I think one of the distinct features that differs the 2004 revolution versus now is that this has very much had a profound impact on the international security environment and the international system. It has garnered far more attention from a far wider array of powers, and how this has begun to influence politics not only in Ukraine, not only in Eastern Europe, but across the world and the international system as a whole. And I think that is a key distinction that I'd like to build on. And part of that, of course, by not focusing more on the internal issues and more focusing on the external issues and the international scope, I think what's important to note, and I've argued elsewhere, is that the response to what we have seen in the last year in Ukraine has actually been stripped of Ukrainians. This has very much become a far larger commentary on Western reaction, on Russian reaction, on international organizations, on multilateral arrangements than it has been about individual Ukrainians and what's going on internally, which I think is part of the great travesty of what has been going on, is the actual stories of things on the ground have become lost in very abstract discussions of Western foreign policy, which of course I will specialize in and talk more about, but recognizing that fact. And so ultimately, when we're focusing on some of the discussions and some of the themes that will come out of this panel, we question whether or not Western governments and international organizations see Ukraine more as an asset, a nuisance, or a pawn in a larger chess game internationally, which is very much part of that abstraction and, in my mind, the depersonalization as to what's been going on the ground. And we pay a lot of attention to Russia for very good reason. One of the key distinctions between 2004 and 2014 was the level of Russian involvement, but that Russian involvement took a very different character. We can call it all-out annexation, all-out war. I think the term that most security experts are using is special war, because you do have not only annexation of the Crimea region, but you also have this coupled with an ongoing effort to destabilize, provide arms, provide funding in eastern Ukraine, which has helped to the destabilization of an entire region. And it has also led to a level of paranoia really not seen since the early 1990s with the end of the Cold War. And that special war is ongoing. And I know that our other panelists will get into Minsk II and how this is being perceived and how this is being enforced. But of course, on a daily basis, there are ongoing reports that the special war is continuing, primarily because I think one of the other distinctions when it comes to the Russian response was that they were intent on escalation. And that escalation has been a marked factor in taking a look at exactly, first of all, the initial response to the outbreak of revolution in the streets, but also in the last year, the fact that the Russians have not backed down, and having been coerced into signing Minsk II via sanctions and the effect of those sanctions, and also the internal perception of those sanctions and how effective they have been. But that escalation does not seem to really have negated or lessened to this point. And changing focus a little bit more to the West, I think taking a look at that Western response is part of the integral component of understanding part of the differences. David had alluded to the fact that the so-called West, particularly the U.S., had taken an interest both in 2004, 2014. But where I would differ with David, I suppose, is I think the U.S. interest in 2004 was actually much stronger than 2014. And one of the main reasons, I should say there are a number of reasons for that, which I'll try to touch on. But one of the main reasons, I think, is that we see in 2014 that other Western governments took notice first, took more hardline responses first, and guilted the U.S. into having to respond in a very different way. And don't forget, of course, we're also dealing with a United States in 2014 that was significantly weaker internationally than the United States that we were looking at in 2004. The ability to affect international outcomes, the ability to influence liberal democratic outcomes, and also to deter any kind of Russian aggression was going to be significantly different. We also see a U.S. that had been significantly weakened even on the rhetorical front by its foreign policy handling of other international crises and trying to deter states from other action. Think here very much of Obama's red line for Syria and what happened to U.S. credibility in the foreign policy sense of trying to deter action when the U.S. chose not to take action after drawing a red line of chemical weapons in Syria. In terms of other Western reaction, one of the interesting aspects here, I think, is the Canadian response rhetorically was among the strongest, certainly among the first and certainly among the most supportive. But again, we question whether or not that response has been as ongoing as it probably needed to be, as robust as it needed to be, and also where it is right now. And there are a number of reasons that I say that. The West as a whole, I think in 2014, faced very different options than they did in 2004. I would say that the West is the so-called Western Bloc is criticized most often for really not doing enough, in some cases not looking at other options, but their options in my mind were fairly limited. There was the option of outright escalation, which I don't think was going to yield the results that, first of all, either Ukraine wanted or that the West wanted. To try to arm Ukraine. This was an ongoing debate, really one that picked up in the United States a few months ago, primarily by congressional Republicans. Canada didn't really seem very interested in it, but of course, by arming Ukraine and arming Ukrainians, there were a number of things lost in this debate, and I think. First of all, the level of arms that would have been required to make a significant difference on the ground was unrealistic. And secondly, and I think more importantly, that would have overtly escalated in the minds of the Russians. So this option immediately looked very good and served the rhetorical purposes of those that wanted to appear to be doing more, but wasn't going to yield the outcome that was necessary. The do-nothing approach, the status quo approach of talking really tough, hoping to throw some money, hoping to throw some supplies, but really not doing very much to deter the outcome, or this idea of containment. And of course, we learned quite a bit about containment throughout the Cold War, but this would have been a very different kind of containment. And one of the challenges that will be ongoing as negotiations move forward is whether or not a solution can be found where the West is willing to accept a partitioned Ukraine, which is what a containment response and a containment strategy would ultimately have to accept, because it's incredibly unlikely that you're going to see any withdrawal of Russian influence overtly and physically from Crimea, and also from that special war and influence mentality in eastern Ukraine. And so those seem to be the options that face the West, and none of which really have played out so overtly. I would also say that ultimately the difference between 2004 and 2014 would be the complicating factors in the wider system of international politics. It's a very different world than it was in 2004. The naval access issue, of course, and the annexation of Crimea, and Russia's paranoia and obsession, I would argue, in rebuilding its navy has become an enormous factor. Throughout the last 10 years, particularly in the last 5 years, Russia's naval capabilities have begun to significantly increase and rebuild themselves. A lot of that has to do with Russia's Arctic interests and Russia's Arctic deployment schedule moving forward, but new classes of submarines, new classes of ship and retrofit have led into some of that calculation. Don't forget that there's now other great powers in the international system that were not quite as overt and not quite as developed as they were in 2004, which complicate the ability of others or the willingness of others to be able to intervene to support democratic movement. Think China and India, non-Western great powers, are beginning to rise in the international system, and we saw with the annexation of Crimea and the Western response to that, that both India and China not only allowed that annexation to take place, but said that they supported this move by virtue of their understandings of national sovereignty and their understandings of the function of international politics. The fact that Eastern Europe right now is only one area of focus, as we know that Western countries are also incredibly focused on what's going on in the Middle East with ISIL. Dual deployments in an era of ongoing defense cuts is incredibly difficult. Canada is a very good example of this. And ultimately, of course, one of the issues is the decline of the United States more broadly. And this decline of the United States has limited their ability to affect those outcomes. We can hear accusations, I think, of Russian paranoia about NATO expansion and Russia paranoia about EU expansion. I think it has far less to do with that than I do a perception on the part of the Russians that they would actually get away with what it is they wanted to get away with in 2014, because the U.S. was going to be both unable and unwilling to respond, as were other Western powers. And I would also note that in 2004, Russia was a key ally in the war on terror. not necessarily for rooting out terrorism and taking part in missions, but hoping that Russia was not going to push its issue to let Western powers, especially the United States, do what it needed to do in 2004 during its war on terror, and hoping that Russia wasn't going to become a complicating factor. So what does all of this mean? First of all, I think that what we're going to see moving forward is I don't see it incredibly likely that Minsk II is going to hold moving forward, though, of course, the hopeful side of me says that it will, but it's not usually my way to be internally optimistic. But I think more importantly, I go back to my starting point, which is that it's very easy for Ukraine to get lost in a much wider commentary as to what's going on internationally. And that is probably the most dangerous part of, first of all, stripping the gains and the identities that were made during these protest movements. But more than that, ultimately dooms the outcome moving forward because the interests of actual Ukrainians are subservient to Western powers on one side, Russia on the other side, and we go very much back to a Cold War mentality where the great power game ends up dictating the ultimate result. And I'm happy to leave it at that.